Thank you very much, Mark. I think this gives a very interesting practical look. The next presentation will aim at actually taking one step back and look at how those observations illustrated by Mark are actually fitting the bigger picture when we look at hundreds, more than 600 sites. So I wish the next talk would have been given by Niklas, because he's the expert. He's been doing that for more than 15 years worldwide. I was hoping that Cecilia, who works for Nicolas, was going to be giving the talk for me. So Cecilia, I know you're here. Yeah, so thank you. Unfortunately, Cecilia had a tooth surgery, so it's a bit more difficult, but she can talk with you if you have questions. She might be better able than I am for some to answer, since I am talking on behalf of Nicolas. So the concept of berry active sugar loading, to me, is very interesting, because it's a way to further decipher ripening kinetics. What does it consist of? It simply consists of switching from monitoring Brix, which is concentration, and instead monitoring the total amount of sugar that the berry can hold, so against its gradient, because what you have to understand is that there is only so much sugar that can be held and maintained within a cell, provided you have to fight against the osmotic pressure that a lot of sugar within a contained environment is exerting, asking for more water to come. So from there, I'm hinting at the fact that there is a physiological threshold to the maximum amount of sugar a berry can take. And how can we characterize the trajectory up until that point is being reached is precisely what the concept of sugar loading is trying to uncover. So if you plot on the y-axis days in, days out, how much sugar in terms of grams per berry is being accumulated, so you remove fluctuations in the concentration that might be caused to berry water losses that have nothing to do with active loading of sugar, you see actually a S-shaped curve. There is a starting point when the berry shifts from being a vegetative organ, as Mark was saying, with functional stomates, up until a sink. It becomes a reproductive organs. The stomates are being frozen in an open position. And essentially, as Mark was showing, there is a lot of water that can be lost because the stomates are no longer functional. During that stage, you can actually characterize how long the berry is actually calling for sugar. You can also say, just like Mark was showing with the date of pH or TA, you can just say when is the date when the plateau of sugar is being reached. And from there, you can also characterize those two together by looking at the slope, the speed at which sugar is loading. You can then characterize another parameter, is how much sugar was being reached at the time sugar loading stopped. And you can then look back at, okay, considering how much volume I had when the peak sugar was reached, what was the Brix, what was the concentration? So with those 5 parameters, we can now really increase the granularity when we go about comparing different maturation kinetics. So you see, we have 5 parameters here that can be characteristics of each maturation kinetics. I think today I'm going to really focus on the parameters number 2, which is the rate of loading during the first phase, so during this really brutal sugar loading. You see that for Cabernet Sauvignon, on a daily basis, less sugar is entering the berry compared to Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And this is probably something structural that is the footprint of the genetic makeup of the plant. So some plants are programmed to have a lot of sugar fast, and some plants are programmed to limit a little bit the speed at which sugar is loading. So what does it mean for Sonoma? Well, what I'm going to present here is a statistical analysis of more than 800 analyses of Cabernet Sauvignon that we've been plotting over the course of the season. And what's very interesting is to see that we can really see this trend appearing of a rapid sugar loading that plateaus around 200, 210 milligrams per berry. And that is actually how 2017 can be characterized. So you can characterize what I refer to the maximum sugar amount, S-max. And you see that in 2017, it was 205 milligrams per berry. It's a lot. You will see in a minute that it's more than in the past. And that's when I have the light bulb in my brain. Oh, that's funny. That's also higher crop coefficient in 2017. But until I demonstrate that, let's also look at when this maximum sugar was reached. Well, it's exactly when Mark was showing the peak of the heat wave, as if the heat wave could knock off this phase of sugar loading. So that's actually the profiles I wanted to compare. You see that 2017, just like was announced by the plant architectural parameter, is characterized by a higher maximal amount of sugar. I think that's very interesting because maybe, and this is purely speculative at this stage, but maybe we can connect plant inherent ability to set up its crop coefficient by the end of June with plant inherent ability to accumulate sugar by the end of August. And you see that the math is working fairly well. If you remember, the crop coefficient was gradually going up from 14 to 15 and then increasing almost 20% between 16 and 17. You see a similar trend in maximum sugar. And I am speculating that maybe the plant is announcing the ripening kinetics, but hopefully in the future, I will be proven wrong or right according to the data. But if we try to put numbers into that scheme, well, if we look at the maximum amount of sugar, you see very clearly that we have a 20% increase in statistical trend in terms of maximal sugar amount per berry, 205 in 17 versus 170 in 15, and versus 155 in 15. If we look at the speed at which sugar has been loading, so you have different interpretation. When I was talking with Nicolas about how to comment in lieu of him, I asked, why do we have, in your opinion, a faster sugar loading rate in 2017? 5.3 milligrams per berry per day instead of 3 or less than 3. For him, it's because we started accumulating sugar later. Yes, it's possible, and actually you see, if you look at the duration of sugar loading, that it was 31 days instead of 36. And that's a completely valid hypothesis. I'd like to suggest that maybe another reason why we have a rapid sugar loading is also because we had a greater crop coefficient and maybe simply larger vascular tissue, leading to more sugar into the fruit. I don't know which hypothesis is the most relevant. They may be all relevant. I find it's interesting to relate the speed of sugar loading with the inherent plant ability at converting light into sugar, which is what KCB is telling us essentially. Another interesting point is that in spite of having a shorter period of active sugar loading, we reach a greater Brix. Meaning that maybe the speed at which sugar was loading outpaced the speed at which berry volume was increasing. So even if both berry volume and sugar loading happened at the same time, proportionally, sugar is loading faster than the berry volume is growing, which is not always the case, as you can see in 16 and 15. So here I'm hinting at the fact that there was a very rapid accumulation of sugar, and that may also explain why we have this lack of ripeness, phenolic ripeness, even for high Brix, as our keynote speaker has highlighted and as Mark has also hinted at. So you see, we can say a lot by simply looking at those sugar loading profile. So essentially, the take-home for Cabernet Sauvignon, shorter period of sugar loading, a faster speed of sugar accumulation, and the result is more sugar per berry. So now, let's look at berry volume. Since it drives the yield, it's also an important parameter to look at. Classically, it's a bell-shaped curve, particularly in arid climates like Californian or Mediterranean climate. It peaks and then it declines. So if you look at the second section of this graph, the one that stretches from September 2 up until October 8, what it is interesting to do is looking at how fast we observe a decline. So we can actually quantify the berry volume loss that is being observed. And in 17, we had the most spectacular drop in berry volume that has been recorded over the last 3 years. And again, that is very coherent with what Mark was saying about the pressure exerted by those late season heat spell. And that is also very well aligned with the fact I was saying earlier, greater crop coefficients, are more at risk of late season water deficit. And this data seems to corroborate with a different method that at the berry volume level, it's a similar phenomenon. Actually, you see that over the last 2 years, we were losing berry volume. Sure, that's expected, but twice less. And we had also lower crop coefficient. So you see how I am trying to connect the dot here between the plant and the fruit through Nicolas' presentation. So this is the second take-home. If we purely focus on berry volume, we were set to have bigger berries, as the crop coefficient was suggesting, but the heat wave actually was a bigger toll on the berry volume loss, since we lost 22% instead of 11%. So I'm going to fly through the next 3 slides, but I invite you to speak with Cecilia. But essentially, there is a nice follow-up with the monitoring of sugar loading, because you can use the sugar loading end as a reference point to time the window of your harvest depending upon how many days after cessation of sugar loading you decide to harvest. The concept that has been confirmed by Nicolas and Cecilia is that the more you wait until after sugar loading stops, the more the aromatic profile is evolving from a fresh fruit aromas towards a ripened fruit aromas. That on the aroma level, but if you look at the mouthfeel and tannin, which hopefully will be the discussion that we will trigger with Tori during the second part, you have also an impact of the harvest date positioning with respect to the physiological stages of ripening the berry is at, with the idea, again, that the closer you are to sugar loading cessation, the greater will be tannin reactivity, so therefore the perception of astringency, and the lower will be the perception of sweetness. And the later you are, the lower is the perception of astringency, and the higher is the perception of sweetness. So that was for Cabernet Sauvignon. Now for Pinot Noir, what is the picture? Well, the picture we have is, again, a tendency to have this rapid sugar loading curve reaching, as we expect, like it is with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, a higher level compared to Cabernet Sauvignon. You see, 25% more of sugar has been incorporated into the berries at the time the berry stops calling for sugar. And the stops, fortunately in the case of Pinot Noir, happened before the heat waves, which probably sets the ripening kinetics of Pinot Noir in a very different realm compared to the Cabernet Sauvignon, because they were early varietals, early ripening varietals. And you see, they just stopped accumulating before the heat wave. So, essentially, you see that it means that compared to the previous years, we don't see such a huge gap between the last 2 years. So, the sugar loading occurred naturally and stopped around 250, which is not so different from the previous 2 years. Or actually, the last column is the average of the last 5 years. So the take-home is we were on par with previous vintages. The duration of sugar loading was not reduced. So again, it's very important to distinguish how to read those sugar loading profiles according to the specifics of the varietal. So you see two very different pictures depending upon Pinot Noir or Cabernet Sauvignon. So the conclusion for the Pinot Noir is that we had, unlike Cabernet Sauvignon, a classical pattern of sugar loading. In terms of volume, well, again, it's not as bad as what we've seen with Cabernet Sauvignon. We lost berry volume, but only 13%, which is more, but not so much more as it was with Cabernet Sauvignon if you look at the average in California or how Sonoma was over the last 2 years. So the conclusion for berry volume, the game was set to have larger berries. Well, it's not a surprise since the crop coefficient was already set to be bigger. And we also observed a berry volume that was there, but relatively on par with what's expected. In the interest of time, I'm going to fly through the last slides that try to connect the positioning of harvest window with the sugar loading ends, but I invite you to speak with Cecilia if you want to have more info. So before we break the session, I would like to leave the room with this question. Okay, we've understood how sugar was loading. We understood how the plant architectural parameters were setting up the stage for fast or slow ripening kinetics. But what does that mean for phenolics? What is the link between sugar accumulation and color accumulation? Are those two happening in sync, or are they actually decoupled? And what does it mean from a winemaker standpoint? Should we still position our harvest date based upon early information coming from the sugar loading, or should we less and less rely upon sugar loading in order to actually focus on phenolic maturation? Are we going to grow grapes based on phenolics, or are we going to grow grapes based on yield? Those are the questions that hopefully we're going to discuss during the second session. But for now, I think it's time for the coffee break. Thank you for your attention, and we'll reconvene in approximately half an hour.